Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Welcome and hello. I'm David Hornsby, the managing editor of Alain Elkann Interviews. Alain is a very experienced interviewer who it is my pleasure to work with and who has conversed with many diverse subjects over tens of years. Alain adores making interviews, as he says on the cover of the Assouline publication of a selection of a mere 78 of these. Making interviews has been like going to prolonged university, because each interview is like having a private lesson from an interesting person on a different subject. We hope you have as much fun listening to his interview with the historian and TV presenter Simon Sebag Montefiore as we have had making it.
This is your last book, right?
This is my newest book, yeah.
So
I mean, I wrote about, before this I wrote about Jerusalem. And I wrote a book about Jerusalem where I love Jerusalem, and my family has always had a special relationship with the city and everything. So that was a very different sort of book, and now I've gone back to the Russians.
Why did you write a book on Jerusalem, and then why you went back to Russia?
Well, Jerusalem, the Montefiores, who are, of course, sort of Italian Jews originally, and before that, Spanish, Portuguese, Mexican Jews. So it's a very Sephardic story. But anyway, at one point, my ancestor, Moses Montefiore, went to Jerusalem in the 1820s to the 1860s, and he founded the new city of Jerusalem and built the Montefiore windmill, which is still there, and so on. Our family motto is Yerushalayim, is Jerusalem. My sort of signet ring says Jerusalem. His picture's out here, by the way, Montefiore. So all my life I've been brought up going to Jerusalem, and I always wanted to write a history of Jerusalem, mainly because there is no such history existing quite like this history, with all empires, races, religions through 5,000 years, And so when I was ready to do it, I started to write this.
You lived in Jerusalem?
I spent a lot of time there, yeah. I lived there a lot of time. I lived in a hotel, but I went there a lot. I stayed in the American colony mainly.
And what did you do? You researched?
I researched, I met people, I tried to understand archaeology and history and all the different empires. And so that book, it's a sort of history of all the empires. It's a sort of history of the Middle East, really. It's also out in Italy, in Italian.
As you follow Jerusalem, what do you think should happen there? What do you think?
Well, I'm I guess what you'd call an old-fashioned sort of Labour peacenik, an extinct breed now. But, I believe in two-state solution. Jerusalem should be shared, should be the capital of both states. And the deal is pretty much agreed at the peace deal. Everyone knows what the peace deal would be. The swap of settlements for land, so on. East Jerusalem would be the capital of a Palestinian state. I'm not sure it's exactly the right time now. But one of the themes of my book is that it's impossible to make these peace agreements and to gain trust without understanding and recognizing the full narrative of the other side. And that's one of the huge things that's missing. And that's one of the huge things I wanted to do in this book, because it's very even-handed. It's not a Zionist history. It's not a pro-Palestinian history. It recognizes the full histories of both religions and peoples, which is quite a hard thing to do.
The book was well received.
It was well received by both sides. Obviously, Hamas and Bibi Netanyahu don't like it, but both sides like it, and the right people hate it, which is essential. The right people, the correct people hate it. The extremists on both sides hate it, and the other people like it, which is what I want.
You think this Trump trip has...
No, I don't think he's got a clue about why it's a difficult deal to make. But what is interesting at the moment is that the idea of bringing in, the Sunni powers, the Gulf monarchies, into the peace process is a good idea. And I think that's the only hope. But I actually think that the Netanyahu government has no intention of ever making a sort of proper peace deal. I also don't think it's the right time at the moment to make a deal at all.
Why?
You need a new leadership on both sides, really. You have an unelected octogenarian president of Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. You have Hamas. You can't really make this deal with Hamas, I don't think. So in one sense, I can understand why they're delaying it. Is this any time to risk your security? But on the other hand, the clock is ticking, and if Israel doesn't make a deal soon, there'll be a one-state solution, which can only be solved by Israel with apartheid system. So we're in a very dangerous time, actually. Israel seems absolutely triumphant and strong in a region of chaos, but obviously its democracy has potential flaws in the sense that, there could soon be a majority of Palestinian people in the Jewish state. How to cope with this? So that was Jerusalem, the book. That was a love letter to Jerusalem, and I love Jerusalem. And as I said, I'd been brought up with it all my life. Our family motto is Yerushalayim and so on. So that was a special thing I'd always wanted to do.
But you are a specialist in Russia.
In Russia. I've always written about Russia. I love writing about Russia.
Why? Because you studied there?
I think a lot of reasons. First of all, family reasons. Again, with this Montefiore character, he went in
Family reasons first.
Family reasons first. I think as a child, he went to intercede for the Jews in Russia in 1846. He went to see Tsar, Emperor Nicholas I. And so I remember as a child looking at a picture of him, it said, Montefiore meets the Tsar, Nicholas of the Romanovs. I was thinking...
That's were the first who helped the Jews in order to...
He went to intercede against persecution of the Jews. And Nicholas I, it's in the book somewhere, the full story, if you need to check it, but Nicholas I said if all the Jews were like you, it would be easier to be tolerant of them, which of course was a sort of highly patronizing comment. So there was that. And then my mother's family are all Ashkenazi. We all came after the pogroms in 1904. They all left Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and came to England.
In 1904?
In 1904, yeah. After the Kishinev pogrom. So I had a sort of Russian... my family has connections with Russia. But also, I did Russia at university at Cambridge, and was fascinated by... I did Catherine the Great, actually, and the Enlightened despotism.
You were fascinated by Catherine the Great?
I was fascinated by Catherine the Great, and I was fascinated by Stalin. And I wanted to write books on both these subjects from when I was in my 20s.
And you did? And
I did in the end, which is it's always lovely to have, if your hobbies become your profession.
Yeah, and your books are very interesting. And then you wrote this new book on the Romanovs.
Yes.
The last.
One of the things I wanted to explain was the exceptional character of Russian, power and society. And especially at the moment with Putin, with Crimea, with Syria. This was 2 or 3 years ago. But I wanted to explain. I thought it was all
with the Romanovs.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I thought, because as you know, in the Romanovs, I take it at the end, and in the paperback, I've updated it. So I take it right up to Trump. And Trump, of course, wants to be an American Tsar, essentially. But I think I wanted to explain it. And again, I looked for a book that dealt with the whole Romanov dynasty and right up to the present afterwards. And there is no such book. There have been 2 excellent books on the Romanovs, but only 2. And they all handled it without a narrative. They just did it by analysing sort of domestic policy, home policy. I wanted to produce something kind of unique, which is a narrative, sequential story of how power worked over 300 years, 400 years, and to explain how power developed in Russia. And I wanted it to handle family, politics, war, culture, all these things fused together. And though there were millions of books on the Romanovs, most of them are just on Nicholas and Alexandra, as you know. And actually, 1 or 2 are on Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. But this was my project. And of course, it turned out to be a lot more difficult than I expected when I actually started to do it. But I also wanted to write a book, and this is true of all my books, that can be read by anybody. You don't have to be a Russian expert. You don't have to even know where Russia is, in fact, to read this book. It could just be a saga of power, of emperors, of murder and intrigue and conspiracy and adultery and all the rest.
This is what you like in your books, no? Or even in Stalin and his court, no? You like to talk about their wives, their habits, their drinking,
yes.
children, their feeblenesses. By the way, you open the Stalin biography with the last night of his wife with a dinner.
That's right.
And there are all the details and how she dresses. And in a very concentrated number of pages, you tell us so many things, right? About him, the environment, the Kremlin.
That's right.
And all that. And how proud was Stalin to be in the Kremlin where Ivan the Terrible had in the same rooms that were occupied by Ivan the Terrible, right?
Exactly. So what I'm trying to do, I always start all the books with a kind of first prologue, which is meant to introduce atmosphere with details in a cinematic way, but showing essential themes of that run through the whole book. And I mean, I want my books to be absolutely academically correct and based on original archival research. But then there's no reason to write an unreadable book. I mean, any academic can write an unreadable book, and then many of them do. But then I want the book to be literary. I want it to be beautifully written if possible. And I sweat blood to try and achieve this.
You're considered an historian?
I'm considered a historian.
A serious historian? Or?
I'm considered a serious historian.
You are.
Whether you consider me that is quite a different matter.
I do, but I mean, as your books are very narrative and you also do television.
And I write novels
and
also.
You write novels.
Yeah, I am considered that. I'm a privateer of history. I don't teach at university like you have done recently. I'm an independent writer, so I'm not attached to any institutions, but I take the academics very seriously, and the real academics, the people I admire all like what I do, but obviously there's some jealousy and but mainly not from the great professors, mainly from people who are somewhere in between the great professors. And
tell me something, as we understand, by your books, by Catherine, by Potemkin, by Stalin, and now the Romanovs. You obviously know Russia very well. I mean,
yes,
politics,
I've been there a lot.
Places.
Yes.
Putin's Russia is more or less the same. What's the difference between Putin, Stalin, the Tsar, or Ivan
Well, you're right.
Terrible?
That's the million-dollar question.
About Catherine the Great, if I remember well. They annexed Crimea as much as they did now, right?
Yeah. Well, funny enough, that book is now being republished in Russia, surprise, surprise. And it's very funny because I think it's going to be titled something like Catherine of Potemkin, Conqueror of the Crimea, which is quite funny in a way. And by the way, Angelina Jolie is trying to make a movie of this book, which actually I think is going to happen, believe it or not.
Of Catherine?
Of Catherine of Potemkin, and she will play Catherine. That's the plan anyway. I'd be childish to say Putin was Stalinist or Putin was a Romanovs emperor, but having said that, he's obviously a hybrid of a fusion, a hybrid of Romanov emperor, Stalinist general secretary, and a modern 21st century politician. I mean, he deals in a world of television, of internet, asymmetric warfare, and he's quite a master of these very modern things. But if you're asking how does the court work, how does the court of Putin work? First of all, his entourage, many of them call him the Tsar, by the way. Secondly, the only things he really reads, he's not a great reader, but the stuff he does read are biographies of Romanovs, emperors. And he has read, the only thing I know he's read is my Catherine of Potemkin book, which he read 15 years ago when it came out, because he discussed it with George W. Bush on that first trip George Bush made to Petersburg. And thirdly, the way I think The Economist actually wrote this in their review, but the way the Putin entourage works is very, very similar, almost interchangeable. If one puts aside all the modern stuff that I've explained of intercontinental missiles, digital warfare and all this kind of stuff, but if you put aside all that and you actually look at the personal, you have a tiny entourage, a czar, a tiny entourage, and completely opaque decision-making in secret, with vast fortunes and power delivered to people, taken away, and the desperate attempt of the single ruler to balance all these decisions and pressures. I mean, the most interesting thing is when you look at it is very similar to the way the Romanov court worked and to the way Stalin's court worked, and it is a fusion of the two. And in many ways, Putin quite self-consciously is very aware of those two highly prestigious legacies. So he's not really ideological. He just looks at successful rulers of the motherland. So successful czars would be Stalin, the most successful of all. People like Nicholas I, Alexander I, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. And unsuccessful czars for him would be primarily Gorbachev, slightly Yeltsin, definitely Nicholas II, and Alexander II. So he's interested in success and failure of state power in Russia. Another interesting thing, I think, is that when we look at them from the outside, these people, whether we're talking about Stalin, Peter the Great, Putin, we look from the outside and we look at them enviously, these swaggering strongmen who can make any decision. I mean, that's part of the reason President Trump has a sort of crush on the idea of Putin, is that Putin is his kind of dream character, who can do what he wants, isn't paralyzed by democratic procedures and a legislature that can't decide anything.
I think there is a link. Because of Putin, he will be in trouble.
Yes, I think so.
He had all these intrigues before the elections.
My belief is that, first of all, let me just finish the thought I was just saying a second earlier, which is that the great thing that we don't understand about Russian rulers is that they are deeply insecure. I mean, the Russian rulers, because in a system with no checks, no balances, no boundaries, no restraint, they can do what they like on paper, but in actual fact, they are very vulnerable. And, one of the lessons of this book is that, they are most likely to be killed by their own courtiers. And so it's impossible to be paranoid as a Russian ruler. You have to exist in a permanent state of ferocious vigilance. So looking at it from the inside, Putin every day, I think, is more afraid than we realize of what could happen to him in the future and how to keep power for him and his small group. But to answer your question about Trump, I think two things were going on there. I mean, first of all, this is the greatest triumph of Russian or Soviet intelligence in all of history, to separate an American president from his security apparatus. I mean, the idea that Russian intelligence or Soviet intelligence could separate and alienate, the American presidency from their own security apparatus, which is basically what's happened. No Russian or Soviet spy master could achieve that in their dreams. They've paralyzed American power in a way. So a great success for Russian spycraft.
It wasn't Putin, the KGB.
Yeah. So this is something they will be congratulating themselves on. Secondly, I think from Trump's side, I think this is partly childish hero worship. In the same way that we watch the Godfather films and wish that we had the glamour and power of Don Corleone, so this real estate magnate with a huge inferiority complex looks across and sees this leader who seems to be able to do what he wishes, who walks around with swagger, has a proper machismo, and thinks, God, if I was in politics, that's what I would have liked to be. The other part of it is that clearly, the Russians were interfering in American democracy. And I don't think they ever thought that Trump would win. I think they thought that Hillary Clinton would win. And their aim was to undermine her entire presidency as much as possible. Because the hilarious thing about the Russians is they don't believe that the American or British system or Italian systems are remotely democratic. They think the whole thing is fixed and corrupt. So the Russians would presume that if Hillary Clinton is the establishment candidate, the election would be fixed for her anyway. It would be unthinkable that she could lose the election. They have a very primitive view of our democracies, and they think that everything is fixed. And that's why one of the reasons they have contempt for our sanctimonious view of our own rectitude.
But they don't understand that.
They don't understand it.
But even Putin, who is half German, who was trained.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think they think these things are pretty much always fixed. So this is just my kind of feeling. I don't believe that expected Trump to win. When he did win, they thought, like, this could be an opportunity. But actually, the Russians hate kind of crazy instability. I actually think, while laughing at Donald Trump and enjoying the instability in Washington, I actually think they're very conservative, really. You know, now they've got someone that, and I mean, Putin's entire kind of foreign policy was basically trying to undermine treaties and established order and international affairs. Now they have somebody, they cannot predict what he's going to do, and who's someone who's even more unpredictable than Putin. I think this will make them very uneasy. And ultimately, I think they'll rather wish they had Hillary Clinton.
But you think that ultimately, because of this, he will be impeached?
I know no more than any of us do about what these connections are. I think partly, my personal suspicion is partly they've been played by the Russians, who are super sophisticated at all the things that we, Western intelligence, I mean English, not just American, need to catch up on fast. I mean, they are so much better at understanding the internet. It's an ironic thing that what was invented in Silicon Valley by American, ingenuity and genius has been much better used in political terms by, the denizens of a totalitarian system. That's an ironic thing, but that needs to change. All Western democracies need to get much more sophisticated at this, fast, But I think also, there's great naivety and clumsiness in these contacts on the side of people like General Flynn, Trump, Kushner, whatever's happened. It seems to me that they didn't realize what they were doing at all. I think what they were doing may well have been illegal and improper, but I think they were way out of their depth. And I'm not sure they completely understood what they were doing.
What's going to happen?
I think Trump may well not finish his first term. He may well not, but I suspect that he will finish it. But I think that it's very hard in the American system to impeach a president.
He can do lots of damages in between.
Yes, he can do a lot of damage in between. I mean, this Paris climate change, he has cunning, there's no doubt about it, but he's also quite naive, I think, about...
Why does he want to do that?
I don't understand that. That is just about playing to his base in America, which voters who believe that everything in international affairs is some sort of conspiracy against America by, an international establishment of some sort. And I think that in his mind, he probably thinks that's a cheap thing to deliver to them. Given the fact that they're very disappointed about him, for example, bombing Syria and other things, which are more traditional Republican foreign policy actions. So I think he's extremely ruthless and cunning, but none of it. He's going to do a lot of damage in the process. You're right.
Yeah, but the other one is shrewd, Putin, right?
I think Putin is shrewd.
He's a good chess player.
Yes.
Trump doesn't seem to be such a good player.
I personally think that the idea of a kind of world deal between Russia and America would work if we had common interests with them. And we have some, but there are a lot of things we don't have an interest, don't have in common with them. And then the fallout between these two quite touchy individuals could be bad and dangerous for us. And you're right. I personally think that, someone who's made their name in American reality television would be eaten alive by someone who's survived in the Kremlin for almost 20 years. So I agree. I think, Putin is highly shrewd. Originally people thought that Putin was the sort of accidental president, and he was chosen almost at random by Yeltsin's familia, the entourage of Yeltsin. But actually he's turned out to be much more than an accidental lead. He's turned out to be a highly skillful, opportunistic player, expert at exploiting the weaknesses of Western democracies, which sadly today are plentiful.
How long can he last?
Well, he can last another 20 years, I think. But his system is quite rigid. I mean, the Russian state and economy is not very flexible. It remains oil-based, rent-paying, highly corrupt. The infrastructure hasn't been structured, and they're very nervous about anything. I mean, they're very nervous about any kind of opposition or popular protests. I mean, their great terror, their great fear is, people power, sort of like the Arab Spring happening there. I mean, the thing that really alarmed the Kremlin, if you talk to them, top Russian people, the thing that really spooked them was the killing of Gaddafi, because there was a sort of a leader who'd been the established government of that country, backed by the Soviet Union for 30, 40 years, suddenly just ripped to shreds on television. And, you know, one of the themes of this book is that the only leader in the whole of modern Russian history who's been overthrown by popular protest was Nicholas II. All the rest were killed by their own people, or terrorists. But in Russia, once you have complete control of the security apparatus, it's quite difficult to overthrow a leader. But that's their great fear anyway.
Think that the new French president can do something?
Yeah, I think it's very encouraging that he may well have a majority or a large win in the elections. For this party that he's created. I think he's the most astonishing character to rise in Western democratic politics that I can remember, in recent times. I mean, his rise shows such kind of courage, and this is a guy that can quote Molière, during his interviews. I mean, he is literally the anti-Trump, isn't he? He's the very opposite. On the other hand, of course, French democracy is notoriously unmanageable, unreformable. Anyway, we'll see. If this experiment ends in great disappointment, there'll be a high price to pay in terms of, an anti-establishment candidate at the next election. After all, this is precisely what happened in America. A young, highly dynamic leader rises to power like Obama, fails in many of his enterprises, and then the backlash is pretty extreme.
So you hope it's not the open door to Madame Le Pen?
Yes. Precisely, yeah.
And Germany, you think, will elect, Angela is like Putin, will be there forever.
I think she's going to be there forever, pretty much. But she's a reassuring figure, isn't she?
But she's quite tough.
She's tough. She's really tough.
America and Germany are fighting.
Yeah. And again, I think it's very, it's unwise of Trump to go down this road. I think Mutter will be able to deal with it. Mutti, what is she called? Mother, yeah. Mummy will be able to deal with it.
What about England?
God, I mean...
maybe the country that has the most strange historical destiny at the moment is England, in the sense that the others have proofs, they fight, they say, but things are the same, more or less. I mean, instead here, you're going through not only a bizarre election, but also this new word, Brexit, means...
Yes.
What?
No one knows what it means. Well, the moment in England, no one knows what it means. And no one knows how to get it. And no one knows what it will cost. I mean, no one knows.
Why in England there's no one... Okay, democracy, but nobody has explained after how terrible this is.
No one understood it. No one expected to win it. The people campaigning for Brexit did not expect to win Brexit. They expected to lose narrowly. We'd earlier had a referendum on Scottish independence, which had also, been lost. The referendum had turned down, independence, and so everyone expected that to happen again. The Conservatives had recently won an election, so no one expected this to happen, and no one had a plan, which is why the people who won the Brexit referendum panicked and turned on each other straight after winning. So we're in a very strange situation here now. No one here has an idea of what this is going to look like. I voted for Remain, and I wish we'd stayed. But I personally think England is quite an entrepreneurial, dynamic economy, and actually whatever happens, we'll cope somehow. We'll muddle through, but there could be high costs to pay first, and I think the English electorate is extremely unstable at the moment. I mean, these are turbulent times. I think that we also have, in Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership of the Labour Party at the moment, I don't know if many foreigners understand that the Labour Party has been captured by a really radical, sort of semi-Marxist group of people here. I mean, more extreme group of people than have ever controlled one of the two big parties here before, and that their views on things like, that they basically are a group that hates Western democracies, hates America, hates NATO, and has a strange sympathy for Marxist dictatorships of the sort of Chavez, Castro, the Soviet Union. They were very sympathetic to, and a grave suspicion of anything Western, American, and also the anti-Semitism is not understood. I mean, we now live in a time when there is real anti-Zionism dressed up as, or anti-Semitism dressed up as anti-Zionism, but an embrace on the extreme left of all the sort of caricatures of traditional anti-Semitism, Jewish, a mixture of tropes from throughout the history of anti-Semitism, from the blood libel to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to ideas about, Jewish capitalist and media control. We are living in a really scary time with this. So this Labour Party, those tropes are out of control in the present Labour Party. So we have a really kind of anti-democratic, anti-capitalist kind of clique has control of the Labour Party here now. But for young voters, Jeremy Corbyn just seems like a sort of innocent granddad who is telling them the
Same
truth.
of Bernie Sanders.
Yes, he's like a Bernie Sanders
Look
figure.
the same also.
Very similar, very similar. But Bernie Sanders was not a sinister character. I mean, he was leftist, but he was not. But these people are very sinister. They met with the IRA. They're sort of, if you look at all their views over the last 30 years, you realise that they always give the benefit of the doubt to Stalin, Castro, the IRA, Hamas, while they always disbelieve and instinctively dislike anything that comes to do with the traditional Western alliance, for example.
You study the world of the past, right? You studied the world of Catherine the Great, the world of the Romanovs, the world of Stalin. I mean, the world was always troublesome, right?
It's always been unstable. It's always been unstable.
Right?
I don't really buy into these people who go, this is like the 1930s again. First of all, history never repeats itself anyway. The present is always a fusion of different strands of the past.
Repeat.
Mistakes
I mean,
repeat.
Hitler did the same mistake that Napoleon did.
Yes, they
100
do
years
repeat.
Before, right?
Yes, but it's always a fusion of the present too, which makes it unique. I mean, of course, the more you know history, the more useful it is, but it has to be a breadth of history. I mean, George W. Bush, Bush II, for example, he loved reading history, but he only read sort of World War II, Munich and, 1940, 1941 sort of history. So every foreign leader seemed to him like Hitler. I mean, Hitler parallels are a bad idea generally, especially for politicians. So I think it's okay for historians, but politicians, it's generally a bad idea, don't you
What
think?
is the role of an historian today? What is your role?
I think one's role is to inform and to warn of dangers in the future, but also to entertain, I think especially with, when you look at the totalitarian century of blood that was the 20th century, especially which I've written about with my Stalin books. I think with that period, especially with Hitler and Stalin, we have a duty to warn of how these things happen. And how they happen is by society getting used to unacceptable things. I mean, that's how the Holocaust happened, actually. This is not to say that I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler, but what you see in American politics today is people getting used to things that should be unacceptable. And that's why the newspapers, it really is important that the newspapers, the New York Times, and whatever you think of them, they do now have a big role in keeping people aware of where these things can go.
But Trump's voters don't read the New York Times.
No, but other people do. And, actually more and more people are now reading these things. So that's a good thing. I mean, that more and more people are turning to these again. The New York Times sort of subscription has gone up. Of course, it's a small number, but the rest of the country can stop these things, as they could have stopped these things in any of those countries in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Actually, these people never had a real majority, but people did nothing, So the historian, the writer's duty now is to inform, to undermine, to question, to warn of the past.
Yeah, but the difference of many other countries, just to go back to you, we talked in this conversation about two completely different things. At the beginning we talked about Jerusalem, and the story of Jerusalem, it's like a story of woman that is loved and abandoned, then loved again. I mean,
that's what the book's about. Yeah, we love that. We love that imagery.
Yeah,
that's the imagery of the Jew in the Torah and the Talmud, isn't it? The sort of Jerusalem sometimes is a beautiful woman wearing scarlet robes.
But then Jerusalem has been abandoned for
hundreds of
years, during the Ottoman Empire, as a provincial place of no importance. It becomes desirable. But that's one thing. The other thing is that you talk mostly about Russia, which is a bit like China, a country where nothing changes. Here we had amazing things like Churchill winning the war and not being elected.
Yes.
So the Corbyn thing is not so strange. And de Gaulle winning, and then he has to go home and comes back many years after the Gaulle.
So we're used to this stuff.
What? So democracy can create Macron, suddenly phenomenon of, instead, these big countries.
It's the same. I think what you're getting at is a key point, which is why I'm not so alarmed at the moment. I think there's complete panic about, these things like Trump. But actually, what you're getting at, I think, as a historian, I look at this and I say, democracy is designed to avoid violent revolutions by absorbing the dramatic changes of popular will. And that is actually what's happening. And that is functioning. A lot of people can vote for Corbyn. A lot of people can vote for Donald Trump. A lot of people can vote for Macron and throw out all the predictable candidates, And that means democracy is still functioning. So it's not, that is what democracy is designed to do. While in China, in Russia, as you said, I agree.
They're not used to that.
They're not used to that, and the system.
And the Middle East is the same.
And they panic. They regard periods of instability when new orders are emerging, as happened in the 90s, or in my books, in 1613, for example, in the 1917, 1918, 1919. They regard those periods with absolute panic. They immediately return to the old way of doing it. So that's what we're seeing now.
Was looked with panic.
That's right.
They need to have...
And that's the theme of these books, really.
Right. And whatever happens, they get Crimea later on, they go into... is just because they don't want to be invaded, right?
Yeah, partly that's right. Russia has no natural frontiers. Russia always feels hugely unstable. To us, looking at it from the outside, we're terrified that Russia... There's always been this fear of the Russian bulldozer. Now it's of the giant Russian army in 1914, the Bolshevik hordes for the Nazis, for example. For us now, it's in the 1840s there was Russophobia. Britain was convinced that Russia was conquering sort of Central Asia and was going to take over Europe. In 1814 we were afraid of Russia dominating Europe when they made it to Paris. And now we're obsessed with Russia is going to take over all our internet and undermine everything. So we have a kind of instinctive fear of the East. Well, for them, they're terrified of being invaded, of being undermined.
But the difference of our countries, Russia is a mixture, it's a Western country, but it's a Muslim country, but it's a Chinese country.
Of course, it's a complete hybrid. It's got, it's a complete, it's an empire and a collection of different peoples of every sort of, and that's the fascination of it.
So what is your next book?
I'm just publishing this week my novel, Red Sky at Noon, which is the last of my Moscow trilogy about a Jewish family in Russia in the middle of the 20th century. And it's all published in Italian, so it's coming out in Italian.
How is it called?
The new book is called Red Sky at Noon, but the first of the books is called Sashenka, and the second one is published in Italian. It's called Love in an Age of Snow. The Italians have just bought that novel, so it will come out in Italian. But
there are 3 novels.
There are 3.
It's a trilogy.
It's a trilogy, yeah. So this completes the trilogy now. So that's coming out now.
And this will be a television series?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. It would be fun if it was. All the books are now being made into TV dramas or movies.
And this is the story of a Jewish family
It's a Jewish family in Russia, and it's sort of set in the 30s and 40s, basically, under Stalin, but also it goes right up to the 90s as well. You should have a look. You might be amused.
I'm sure it's good. So you are a historian and fiction writer. What do you like the best?
Actually, I love writing fiction the most, if I'm honest, because I like to create characters. Well, with history, of course, everything has to be correct. And these history books are huge tasks, mentally. The research, the history is a huge task, is sort of mentally, almost physical, labor-intensive toil, and just reducing this colossal amount of material down to something like this.
How much do you work?
A lot. I mean, I'm quite a workaholic.
Do you write every day?
Yeah, I do. But like every writer, I have days when I just can't do anything. I spend the day in my dressing gown. Or I go and sit in a cafe. It's probably the same with you, perhaps.
You write almost a book every year.
Yeah, I write a lot of books, but I'm kind of exhausted with writing these giant history books, actually. Now I'm starting to write movie scripts a bit, which is a new thing, but everyone's buying my rights to my books. So I think
journalism is
and I've never really done much. I did journalism in the 90s a lot, and I loved it. And then I started to write these books. You can't do everything. If you try and do everything, you do nothing well, I think.
But how do you work?
I always work on one thing at a time. Like, whatever I'm doing, I totally immerse myself in it. I try not to do jumping around for lots of different things. So if I'm doing one of these history books, I literally immerse myself in it. I listen to the music of, Tchaikovsky or whatever. I'm reading, about the arts I'm reading the poetry. I'm trying to immerse myself in the period. And when it's finished, it's finished. And then I go and do something else.
But you have a schedule?
No schedule.
You wake up, you go to the
No,
bed.
it's chaos. No rules.
You don't write every morning.
I write in the morning. I write in the mornings. I get up as early as I can and I work, and then I write as long as I can. And then I like to stop at about 2:00 and just go and have lunch and stop for the day. That's the ideal day. So you work from sort of 6:30 in the morning till 2 or something like that.
And then then you're a father.
I'm a father. I see my friends. I go to the gym, do boxing, which is essential because it's very frustrating sitting down all day.
And you have a social life. You go out.
I go out a bit, yeah. But I love to travel most of all. That's why for example, this Italian prize is fun because I love Tuscany. So I just love flying. I'm staying on some sort of wine estate, which is, who funded this prize, and that will be...
But you spend most of your time in England, in London.
I go to America a lot, actually. My new thing is going to South America. So I just went to Cartagena to speak there, which I love, in Colombia. And now I'm going to Mexico in September to talk again, because the books have suddenly done very well in Spanish.
And you go to America to promote the books? So you go where? Everywhere?
New York, Miami. I'm fascinated by America. I just went to give a speech in Nebraska, which I'd never been to. Once is enough, but it was good to be there.
So you are happy with your choice? Not
being a writer, you mean? Yes.
Not to be a journalist, but to be a writer.
Yeah, I think it's a great life.
But you haven't yet completely decided if you are a fiction writer or an historian.
No, I'll never decide that completely. I'll never decide that completely. But I feel that with my body of work as a historian, I've done enough now on sort of Russian monarchs and Russian dictators and so on.
Otherwise it will be like Troya.
Yeah.
I have a friend in Italy, he's called Guerri. He writes on ashes.
That's right. I don't want to be like Troya. I don't want to be like Troya, just pumping out the same again. If I'm going to do any more history, it needs to be something fresh and completely different. Probably something more in the new world than the old world,
But do you think internet, not because you write in a computer, but internet has changed your work?
No, I don't think it has. It just all it means is that I waste much more time than I should on wasting time looking at Twitter and crap like that, which I should never look at. It should be banned for all writers.
And you prefer physical books?
Yeah, I love physical books, as you can see. I'm not into Kindle.
Kindle is not doing so well.
No, I actually think physical books are a joy. But I love paperbacks that you can really, light paperbacks.
And to be a writer in England is a good thing. You are considered. All the writers are nothing, like in Italy, for instance.
Oh, I thought in Italy. Well, looking from here, it's the opposite. We look at Italy and we think like, surely, Calvino and all these people are sort of treated. Writers in Italy are so respected.
When you are a writer, they ask you in which newspaper, but you're also a journalist, right?
Yeah.
When I started, I thought when they put writer journalist, it was terrible. And then when they did it with me, I understood that this is the only way in Italy.
They understand. But it's not like France where like writers are really respected. France, every writer in the world wants to be a French writer because there you're a star. America and France are the two places to be a writer. Not in England. We have no prestige here at all. And people are very...
Historians may have, right?
No, not really. We don't have public intellectuals here, really.
Thank you very much.
It's so nice to meet you.
Alain Elkann interviews.